The afternoon sun stretched lazily across the rolling fields, casting long golden lines that shimmered against the waving heads of wheat. Near the edge of the pasture, an old red barn stood with its weathered boards and sagging roof, its quiet presence undisturbed by anything more than the occasional flutter of pigeons or the creak of aging hinges in the wind. But today, something different stirred, a movement so subtle it nearly blended into the rhythm of the land itself. It began with a flicker of shadow, low and deliberate, slipping through tall grass with silent precision. The lynx had arrived. No one had seen it approach. One moment, the barnyard had been still, goats lounging beneath the fence posts, chickens pecking lazily in the dust. The next, every animal had gone still, heads snapping to attention, eyes fixed on something just out of sight. The silence was heavy, but not from fear. It was respect. There was a predator among them now, but not one hunting for meat. From her perch on the split-rail fence, Clara, the farmer's daughter, noticed the change first. She narrowed her eyes against the sunlight and leaned forward, scanning the yard. Then she saw it. Low to the ground, fur dappled with amber and gray, muscles rippling with every measured step. The lynx padded across the barnyard like smoke given shape, unhurried but purposeful, ears twitching with each sound beneath the soil and boards. It was a rare sight in daylight. Lynx were nocturnal by nature, elusive and shy, but this one moved in plain view, its amber eyes focused directly on the barn. Clara didn't scream. She didn't run. Something about the lynx's posture felt off. It wasn't stalking. It was investigating. The creature circled the barn once, then paused by the lower wall where a barrel of cornmeal sat undisturbed. Its nose twitched. It pawed once at the soil, then stepped back, listening. The movement was strange, almost too precise, as though it already knew what it was looking for. Clara called to her father, who emerged from the nearby shed wiping grease from his hands. "Pa," she said quietly, pointing, "there's a lynx. It's acting strange." He followed her gaze, his face hardening with instinct. "Get inside," he said quickly. "Now." But Clara didn't move. "It's not after the animals. It's doing something else." Together they watched as the lynx circled again, now stopping near the double doors of the barn. It sniffed the base of the doorframe, then suddenly froze, every muscle tight as a bowstring. Its ears flattened, and with a burst of movement it leapt forward, striking the wood with both front paws. A dry creak followed, and a small puff of dust escaped from beneath the door. The lynx backed away and stared, tail swishing, as if daring something to move. For a few heartbeats, nothing happened. Then came the noise, faint but unmistakable, scratching, scurrying, gnawing. The farmer stepped forward slowly, disbelief etched across his face. "Rats," he muttered. "I'll be damned." He'd heard none of it before. The barn had seemed normal. Grain supplies holding, no chewed holes, no signs of droppings. But now, as if summoned by the lynx's strike, a quiet wave of sound emerged from behind the walls and floorboards. Rats, dozens, maybe more. Hidden, quiet, feeding. The lynx turned its head toward Clara for the first time, as if acknowledging her presence. Then it returned its gaze to the barn and sat down, alert and waiting, its job not yet done. The dust settled, but nothing about that afternoon felt normal anymore. A line had been crossed, an invisible threshold between human ignorance and wild instinct. The barn was not as safe as they thought, and the lynx, the uninvited sentinel, had been the first to notice. The following day brought no rain, no wind, no storm clouds, only stillness, the kind of heavy waiting stillness that made each creak of wood and rustle of straw sound louder than it should. The barn, always a place of simple rhythm and routine, now carried the weight of something unseen and unresolved. And the lynx had returned. Clara noticed it first again. She had taken to watching the barn from her bedroom window, which overlooked the southern paddock and the sun-washed stretch of land leading to the barn's double doors. Just after noon, the lynx emerged from the tree line, the same cautious elegance in every step. Its fur caught the light in golden flecks, but its eyes were fixed forward, sharp and unreadable. This time, it didn't circle the outer walls. Instead, it slipped through the slightly ajar barn door, silent, uninvited, but certain of its purpose. Clara grabbed her boots and rushed outside before her father could stop her. She pushed the barn doors open wider and peered inside, careful not to startle the creature. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The hayloft above hung heavy with silence, and shafts of sunlight pierced through the roof's cracked tiles, illuminating the dust dancing in the air like slow-moving snow. The lynx was walking in slow, deliberate arcs around the barn's interior. It moved between stalls, around barrels, past forgotten tools and rusting pitchforks, all the while circling, first tightly, then wider. At one point, it stopped at the central support beam, sniffed the earth, and scratched at the packed dirt beneath the hay. Clara followed its motion, her breath held, not daring to speak. She noticed the faintest movement in the straw, a ripple where there should have been none. The lynx hissed softly and bared its teeth, not in aggression but in warning. Clara knelt beside the creature just beyond its reach and listened. That's when she heard it again. The faint rustle beneath the barn floor, the whispering scritch of claws and teeth, and then, unmistakably, a chewing sound. Methodical. Destructive. She stood and looked up at the rafters. The sacks of grain stored along the upper loft hadn't seemed disturbed. But she noticed something for the first time. One of the supporting beams, where the sacks were hung, sagged ever so slightly. Not enough to raise alarm, but enough to suggest weight where it didn't belong, or damage from within. The lynx continued its wide, slow circles, now returning to the same few points it had investigated earlier. It moved like a sentinel, measuring the space, mapping what Clara now realized was a pattern. The creature wasn't aimlessly curious. It was triangulating. Later, her father arrived, stomping in with a flashlight and a hammer, ready to drive the lynx out. But the moment he stepped in, the lynx growled low, not threatening, but deeply insistent. It planted itself between him and the central stall, body low, ears forward, tail stiff. Clara stood in front of her father. Wait, just wait, watch it, and they did. For 20 minutes, the lynx traced the same loop again and again, stopping each time in 3 specific places: near the grain chute, beside the hay pile stacked by the back wall, and in front of the main feed bin. Each time it paused, it listened. Sometimes it sniffed. Once it batted lightly at the wooden floor. That was when her father saw it. Just as the lynx tapped the floorboard with one paw, the board bounced. Barely, but it bounced. A hollow spot. He knelt quickly, pressed his hand against the wood, and knocked. The echo was undeniable. He looked at Clara. There's a cavity under here. Clara smiled, her eyes still on the lynx. It already knew. By evening, they had removed the top layer of hay and floorboards to reveal a tunnel, a narrow trench beneath the barn that had been slowly hollowed out, likely by rats or animals seeking warmth. Nestled deep within the earth were shredded remnants of feed sacks, broken kernels of corn, and trails of destruction leading toward the main store. And the lynx? It sat at the edge of the hole, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, expression unreadable, but no longer prowling. Its message had been received. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pasture, and the barnyard animals were restless in ways Clara couldn't ignore. The hens refused to roost, pacing erratically with wings partially spread, their soft clucks turning sharp and uncertain. The goats, usually so calm in the late afternoon, huddled near the fence line, eyes darting toward the barn with silent tension. Even the old mule, a creature too lazy to startle at anything short of a thunderclap, pawed at the ground nervously and refused to enter his usual stall. The barn, once a place of routine and comfort, now pulsed with something else, an unease that sat beneath the surface like a buried fault line. Clara stood at the gate with a feed bucket in hand, watching this strange ballet of agitation unfold. She had tried calling the goats in twice, even rattled their favorite treat pail, but not a single one crossed the barn threshold. Their ears flicked toward it, their noses wrinkled, but not one stepped closer. It wasn't just the rats, she realized. There was something more, something that only the animals, so attuned to patterns in scent and sound, could sense. She looked toward the edge of the field and saw the lynx again. It hadn't left. It lingered just inside the tree line, half shadowed by the tall grass, eyes fixed on the barn like a watchman awaiting a breach. It didn't approach this time. It only watched, motionless, tail twitching ever so slightly in the dirt. Her father approached, muttering under his breath, "This ain't normal, Clara. The animals never acted like this. Not even when we had that coyote problem last fall." "It's the rats," she replied, though even she didn't fully believe it. Or something the rats brought with them. He glanced at the barn, then down at the exposed tunnel they'd uncovered the day before. They hadn't yet sealed it. Beneath the boards, the narrow cavity remained dark and untouched, the chew marks along the foundation more visible now in the daylight. A closer inspection had shown that some of the feed sacks weren't just chewed. They were shredded, torn through violently as if the rats had panicked mid-feast. And worst of all, the grain itself was spoiled, damp, discolored, as though something beneath the earth had leached upward. They'd stored food in that barn for generations. They knew how to keep things dry, sealed, safe. Now, none of that felt guaranteed. As the hours passed, the livestock refused to enter. Chickens nested in odd places, under wagons, behind barrels. The goats brayed until Clara moved their bedding into the storage shed. The mule refused to be led anywhere near the barn, digging in his hooves and turning his head like a stubborn child. That night, the farm felt hollow. Clara lay awake listening to the sounds outside her window. The occasional rustle of wind, the far-off hoot of an owl, and once, the soft pad-pad-pad of paws on the gravel path leading to the barn. She rose and peeked through the glass, heart quickening. There it was again, the lynx, circling the barn in slow, deliberate arcs, just as it had before, pausing in the same 3 spots. Not hunting, not stalking, watching. Beneath the floorboards, the rats were growing bolder. She could hear them now, even from the house, faint but constant, like the churning of something alive and blind. They were digging deeper, chewing more. She imagined them hollowing the barn, out from beneath like termites in a rotting tree, their teeth never resting. By morning, Clara knew the barn wasn't just being visited by a wildcat. It was being guarded. But the question loomed, heavy and unsaid, between her and her father. If the lynx had come to protect the grain, what else might have come because of it? And how deep did the infestation go? They didn't yet have answers, only questions. And outside, the lynx still waited. The morning air was cool and damp, with a thick mist clinging to the fields and crawling low along the barn's perimeter, like smoke too tired to rise. The boards of the barn creaked as they expanded in the shifting temperature, groaning like the old bones of the land. Clara and her father stood in silence outside the structure, tools in hand, both reluctant to enter, yet knowing they had no choice. The lynx was nowhere in sight, but somehow that made it worse. Its absence felt like the lifting of a veil, revealing the weight of responsibility now resting on their shoulders. They had waited long enough. It was time to find out what lay beneath. They began at the spot where the lynx had repeatedly paused, just left of the main grain bin. Using crowbars and a shovel, Clara's father pried up the boards, careful not to splinter them too much. Beneath a thick layer of hay and years of compacted dust, the floor gave way with a dull, empty sound. The first board came up easily, then the second, and beneath them, the dirt looked wrong. It was soft, loose, recently disturbed. Clara knelt down, heart pounding, and dug her fingers into the earth. It crumbled like cake, revealing hollows barely supported by surface crust. The deeper she reached, the more it felt like the floor wasn't a floor at all, just a thin layer above a wide, decaying cavity. Her father joined her, working with the shovel now. After just a few scoops, They uncovered the entrance to a tunnel, narrow but deep. The walls of the tunnel had been clawed and gnawed, packed with filth and lined with droppings. The smell hit them both at once: rot, ammonia, mildew, and something worse, something chemical. Clara gagged but forced herself to keep looking. The tunnel curved downward slightly, leading to a broader chamber that had been dug out directly beneath the grain storage. Here, in the shallow darkness, they found the truth: piles of chewed burlap, shredded paper, bones, small and brittle, likely from birds or even kittens gone missing over the past few months. Empty tin wrappers stolen from the garbage. And in the very center of the chamber, a mountain of contaminated grain, half molded, half consumed, squirming with movement. The rats had made a nest out of it. Hundreds of them had burrowed and bred here, protected by the warmth of the earth and the silence of the barn. It was more than an infestation. It was an ecosystem, self-sustaining and hidden, just inches below their feet. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. In one corner of the chamber, Clara noticed something metallic. She climbed down carefully, knees scraping on roots, and reached toward the object. It was an old irrigation pipe, one that hadn't been used in years. But it was broken, chewed through, the metal edges jagged, and around it the soil was blackened and wet. "Water's been leaking into this nest," she whispered. "For months, maybe." Her father nodded grimly. "They've had everything they need: warmth, food, water." The sound of scurrying returned, not near them, but deeper in the walls. The rats had retreated for now, but they were still close, still listening, still living. Clara suddenly realized how fragile the barn's foundation was. The earth beneath them wasn't solid anymore. It was a spiderweb of tunnels, nests, and decay, and the grain was poisoned, either by mold, rat urine, or both. They climbed out slowly, stunned into silence. Outside, the lynx had returned. It sat just beyond the fence, not watching them this time, but the barn itself, as if waiting to see whether the humans would act on what it had shown them, whether they were finally ready to protect what was left. Clara met its gaze. For a moment, there was something ancient in those eyes. Not wildness, not hunger, but patience. The kind born from seasons spent reading the land in ways humans had long forgotten. The cellar had always been something of a mystery, half used, half forgotten. It was a stone chamber beneath the barn's east wing, carved generations ago when the farm's founders stored salted meats and preserves deep in the cool, dry soil. Over time, it became less vital and more symbolic, a space for broken tools, dusty crates, and rarely needed feed. Its door creaked with age, and most days, no one thought to open it. Until now. Clara stood before it, lantern in hand, the iron key cold and unfamiliar in her fingers. Her father had retrieved it from a hook behind the tool bench, saying little, his face gray with the weight of what they might find. The discovery of the tunnel nest had changed everything. If the rats had carved out a hidden network beneath the grain, who was to say the old cellar hadn't become a vault for something far worse? The key turned with resistance. The lock, untouched for years, groaned as it gave way. Clara pulled the door open, and a wave of damp, musty air rushed out, earthy, sour, and tinged with the unmistakable scent of decay. She lowered the lantern and stepped inside. The stone walls shimmered with condensation. Old shelves lined the sides, and a few rusted cans sat collapsed on one another, their labels rotted to unreadable mush. The stairs beneath her boots were slick with moss and age. But the deeper she descended, the more she felt it. Not just the smell, but the sensation of being watched, of something alive within the stillness. She paused. A sound echoed softly, a faint skitter, followed by the sharp clink of something metal brushing stone. Then it began. From the far end of the cellar, behind an overturned crate, a tide of movement emerged. Dozens of rats poured forth, sleek and swift, eyes glittering in the lantern light. They didn't attack. They didn't flee. They watched. She took a cautious step back as the rats moved in waves, some disappearing into cracks in the walls, others weaving through the shelves, slipping behind barrels and wooden beams. One bold creature crawled atop a sack of forgotten barley and began to chew, right in front of her, with an audacity that made her blood run cold. This wasn't a random infestation. This was a colony, established, fearless, and utterly at home in the depths of her family's barn. Clara turned as her father descended behind her, flashlight sweeping the chamber. It caught on something at the far end, a large section of stone wall that had collapsed inward, revealing a hollow space behind it. A hidden alcove. They moved closer. Inside was a heap of discarded food, molded corn, soft root vegetables turned to sludge, even bits of cloth and string. And atop the pile, centered like a throne, lay the largest rat Clara had ever seen. Its body was thick, bloated with age, and unchecked feeding. Patches of fur were missing, and its face was scarred, one eye milky from damage. It didn't run, it didn't squeal. It simply stared, its single good eye glinting with recognition, with challenge. Her father stepped forward, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The rat hissed once, then vanished into the black behind the alcove, disappearing into a crevice too narrow for any human to follow. They stood in silence. The walls of the cellar echoed faintly with movement. This was no longer just a problem of pests. This was a siege from within. Her father exhaled sharply. "We've been feeding them," he muttered. "Every winter, every storm. They've been growing fat off our waste. And now," Claire added quietly, "they've stopped hiding." Upstairs, the barn groaned again, the weight of its history pressing down on them. The Lynx, they now realized, had not just stumbled upon a few scurrying rats. It had been responding to a shift in balance, a signal from the land that something unnatural had taken root, something allowed to fester in shadows and silence. They climbed back out of the cellar and sealed the door, but it was clear no lock would hold back the truth any longer. This wasn't an invasion, it was a reckoning. The wind picked up that evening, sweeping through the pastures in restless bursts that sent the tall grass bowing and the weathered barn doors creaking on their hinges. The sky above glowed in shades of molten gold and deepening violet, the final moments of daylight fading into uneasy twilight. The world felt suspended, poised between the ordinary and something far older, far more primal. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the barn from across the yard. She hadn't seen the Lynx for hours, and her chest tightened with worry. For days it had been there, appearing like a sentinel each time the rats grew bold. Now, with the depths of the infestation exposed, its absence felt like a missing guard on a city wall. She stepped outside without a word, the screen door clicking shut behind her. Boots crunching over gravel, she moved quietly past the fencing and toward the barn, her lantern bobbing gently with each step. Shadows licked across the field. A chill had settled. But as she approached the threshold of the barn, she stopped short. The Lynx was there. It crouched in the open, completely still, a creature carved from dusk. Its ears were pricked forward, eyes gleaming gold in the lantern's glow. And its face, its posture, was no longer merely alert. It was coiled, focused, lethal. Clara didn't move. She understood now. This was no longer observation. The Lynx had made a decision. It turned its gaze toward the barn's side entrance, the one left slightly ajar for the livestock. Then, with a silent leap, it was inside. She followed slowly, her heartbeat hammering. Inside, the barn felt different. Quieter, but not peacefully so. The air was taut with presence. Somewhere deep in the shadows, the rats still stirred. Then came a sound, subtle, swift. A rustle of straw, a rapid scurry, and then a thump. The Lynx had struck. What followed was a sequence Clara would never forget. The predator moved like a whisper, a flicker of muscle and intention. It wove through the stalls with precise, fluid motion, navigating the debris and shadows like a creature made for this terrain. It was no longer circling, no longer watching, it was hunting. Each kill was quick, a flash of movement, a low growl, the soft crunch of jaws meeting bone. The rats, emboldened and overpopulated, had made a mistake. They'd grown too used to darkness, too unchallenged beneath human feet, and now their dominion was ending. Clara didn't interfere. She stood near the grain chute, watching as nature reclaimed its place with brutal elegance. It wasn't clean, it wasn't gentle, but it was necessary. Hours passed. She didn't know how many. The lantern burned low, flickering. At one point, her father arrived, tools in hand, but paused in the doorway as he saw the lynx at work. He didn't enter. He didn't speak. He just stood beside Clara, eyes wide. They both understood that this was beyond them now. Not in effort, but in purpose. What had begun as a mysterious visitation had evolved into something mythic, a rebalancing. By dawn, the barn was quiet. The floor was littered with the small, broken forms of rodents. The stench of infestation had thinned. The gnawed sacks lay still, untouched. From the cellar below, there was no more scurrying, only silence. And the lynx? It emerged from the shadows as the first rays of sun touched the barn's eastern wall. Its fur was streaked with dust, but its eyes were calm. It passed by Clara without hesitation, without fear, pausing only once to glance over its shoulder at the barn it had defended. Not for loyalty, not for reward, but because some ancient instinct had pulled it to this place, to this moment. Then it disappeared into the grass, leaving no trail. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The extermination was over. But its message, the need to listen, to observe, to respect the wild forces that still moved around them, had only just begun. The morning after the lynx's silent campaign felt different, not just in atmosphere, but in soul. A soft golden light filtered through thinning clouds, casting a gentle glow across the fields, and the barn, which had days ago pulsed with unseen rot and tension, now stood in stillness, not silence born from fear, but one born from completion, resolution, peace. Clara stepped through the barn doors with slow reverence. The straw beneath her boots no longer rustled with hidden life. The grain bins were intact, undisturbed. The air was cool and dry, the stench of ammonia and mold replaced by the earthy scent of dust and hay. In the stall where the lynx had made its final appearance, a faint impression remained, paw prints in the dust. A shallow groove from where it had crouched, waited, watched. A signature left behind not in ink, but in presence. She walked the length of the barn, inspecting each corner, each stall. No new chew marks, no scattering of droppings. The cellar door remained sealed tight, and they had already made plans to flood and reinforce the tunnels beneath, burying the hollow that had grown beneath their feet. But somehow, Clara felt the real cleansing had already occurred. The predators had come, not the rats, but the answer to them. Outside, the livestock grazed calmly. The goats wandered freely, nudging each other playfully near the fence. The hens had resumed their scratching, their clucks light and rhythmic. Even the mule stood in his usual spot, chewing on hay with sleepy indifference, as if the storm of unease had never existed. Animals, after all, knew when danger had passed. They sensed what humans often needed days to admit. Balance had returned. Clara's father joined her near the barn's entrance, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. He didn't speak at first, just surveyed the barn like a man seeing it anew. Not just a building, but a living place. A place that had breathed through crisis and survived. "I still don't understand why it came," he muttered finally, eyes scanning the tree line. That lynx. Why here? Why now? Clara didn't answer immediately. She leaned against the doorframe and followed his gaze, remembering every moment, the first glimpse of spotted fur, the way the animals had responded, the watchfulness, the precision of its hunt, the uncanny way it had known where to go, what to do, and when to disappear. "Maybe it didn't come for us," she said quietly. "Maybe it came because we stopped paying attention." Her father nodded slowly. There was no need to argue. They both knew that, for too long, the signs had been there. The subtle changes in behavior, the odd silences, the unexplainable rot. And they had dismissed them, convinced that the human world still held all the control. But nature had reminded them otherwise. Later that afternoon, they burned the contaminated grain. The flames danced high and hot, consuming the last of the spoiled stores. Clara watched as the black smoke rose into the sky, twisting and coiling into the breeze. Not just a funeral for what had been lost, but a cleansing for what could begin again. They would rebuild, reinforce the foundation, clean the cellar, reseal the walls. But more importantly, they would remain vigilant, not with traps or poison, but with awareness, with respect for the patterns and creatures that lived alongside them, often unseen. That evening, as dusk rolled in like velvet, Clara sat alone on the back fence, staring out at the tree line. No movement came, no glowing eyes, no low growl or shifting form. The lynx had gone. Its work was done. But even in its absence, its presence lingered, in the stillness of the barn, the calmness of the animals, and the newfound depth behind Clara's eyes. Balance had been restored, and the lesson, once carved in claw and silence, was now etched in dust, memory, and the heartbeat of a farm that would never again take the wild for granted.